Hey guys, so today I am back with Invicta, and I'm looking at this video about the Varangian Guard. So either way, these guys are awesome. The Varangian Guard is everything that the Praetorians weren't. Like, for the most part, loyal. For the most part, actually, like, incredibly capable on the battlefield and awesome. And overall, just probably some of the coolest bodyguards in history. So I'm really looking forward to learning way more about them, and very famous. Even I think like the famous Harold Hardrada, whose death signaled the end of the Viking Age, was a part of this group. So pretty famed, awesome like life that this unit had. And like I said, I'm really looking forward to seeing more about them, like how they were formed, what they accomplished, and some of the great battles they participated in. So yeah, I don't really have much else to add, other than if you want to watch the original video by Invicta, the link is down in the description down below. It's always the first link you'll find. And if you want to help support me in any way, shape, or form, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and maybe consider becoming a YouTube Patreon member. It would really help me out a lot. Now with that said, and now without any further ado, let's get to it, shall we? Let us watch Units of History, the Varangian Guard.
In the year 989 AD, Basil II, Emperor of the Romans, sat uneasily on his throne. His realm was splintered between numerous factions, all fighting to be recognized as the true heir of Rome. Constantinople itself was under threat, and all hope seemed lost. Yet, in his darkest hour, the beleaguered ruler would be saved by a fleet rowing down from the north. Aboard were 6,000 veteran mercenaries sent south by Prince Vladimir of Kiev. Their arrival would mark the beginning of a legendary legacy. Now, Basil and these new allies descended upon the rebel forces with vengeful fury. In a single night of blood and fire, the back of the rebellion would be broken, and within a month, the rest of the resistance was crushed. From the ashes of war would rise a newly invigorated Byzantine Empire, strengthened by axe-wielding giants that, from now on, would come to form the core of its formidable military. These were the Varangian Guard, stalwart defenders of the imperial throne, whose watch would last over 400 years.
Wow.
You can learn much more about the life of
The Roman Empire had slowly arisen over 1,000 years, coming to eventually dominate all of the Mediterranean and its border regions. Thus, it came to be that lands which had once been ruled by hundreds of kings were now dominated by a single man. At its peak, the empire was more than capable of holding these vast lands together. However, as the centuries rolled by, internal and external factors made it increasingly difficult to hold it all together. In 293 AD, Emperor Diocletian would seek to stabilize the realms by means of a power-sharing agreement, whereby a pair of senior and junior emperors ruled the east and west. While this exact arrangement would not last long, the concept of a formally divided realm would. Each side would have an entwined history, sharing many cultural features and both identifying as Roman. However, now their fates were no longer locked together. It is this fact which allowed the East to carry on the torch of Rome long after the West had fallen in the late 5th century AD. Known today as the Byzantine Empire, they were the culmination of 1,000 years of history that would persevere for 1,000 more. There were many factors which contributed to its success, ranging from the economic to the geopolitical. However, as one might imagine, its military might was one of the major keys to its success. Long gone was the Roman army of old. While it had proved ideally suited for conquering the Mediterranean, the nature of warfare shifted over the years, forcing it to evolve to meet the ever-changing needs of the empire. By the 10th century AD, the Byzantine army had adopted a new system that will be worth explaining. It was made of several elements which worked together as a well-oiled machine. Perhaps the largest groups were the thematic armies. These were composed of men who...
Yeah, that's I've done some research into the themes that the Byzantines implemented, and it was really a genius stroke. There's some debate about who technically started it, but point is, like, it was such a great theme because essentially kind of breaking down the themes, or I guess another way to call them is provinces, but basically each theme could rally kind of its own army, and basically it helped for a few centuries, basically make especially Anatolia very much unbreakable. Like that's how the Byzantines were able to hold on to Anatolia for so long. And again, it's actually one of my favorite structures. It's such a cool thing. Like, each theme can raise up its own army, and that every person in that theme would want to join, because obviously you want, to protect your land. So there's a lot of self-interest, therefore morale, And obviously, though, later on, it didn't work out, and obviously with the Byzantine/Romans tendency to fight each other, some themes could become very powerful and straight up threaten the emperor. But I think it was such a great system, and I really loved it. Another thing I really like is that, like, I've been thinking about, like, what's the peak of Rome in terms of, like, military, because a lot of people would be like, oh, Trajan, but I'm like, but technically a Byzantine army could, like, destroy an army from earlier on, like, like Trajan. Like, you could say Trajan's the peak of Rome in terms of its territorial, like, expansion for sure, but, like, I always been thinking, like, when's the peak of Rome at its most military strongest? And it has to be in the Byzantine era, at least whenever the Byzantine army was at its strongest, because technically they had far superior equipment, tactics, evolution. So I don't know, that's the thing about the Romans. I feel like it's harder to pin down when they were at their peak or its strongest in terms of military might. I feel like it has to be the Byzantine era, though, simply due to the advancement of technology and stuff. But yeah, you're right. I'm like, it's such an interesting thing.
Who had been given land by the empire in return for a military obligation to bear arms or pay extra taxes in war. Both thematic infantry and cavalry units existed, with a range in quality that should be expected from such provincial levied forces. While not the best of the best, they were nonetheless sturdy and useful troops which could be raised in a flexible, though usually defensive, manner as the need arose. At the other end of the spectrum were the professional standing soldiers. Though fewer in number, they were the formidable core around which the rest of the Byzantine army was deployed. Among their order were many elite guard regiments of both mounted and foot troops who could trace their origins back to the Roman army of old. Increasingly, however, mercenaries were being used to bolster their ranks. These came in all sorts of forms, as the rulers of Constantinople were always looking for ways to use their vast wealth to acquire military talent wherever they could find it. Such mercenaries were grouped together in an umbrella organization known as hetairai, and were akin to a foreign legion. They were typically obtained in bulk through direct treaties between the reigning emperor and neighboring rulers. In addition, their pay came from the emperor himself, rather than the imperial treasury. As private hires, they were therefore technically a separate part of the army, which was, regardless of ethnicity or origin, always tied to the imperial bodyguard. Such an arrangement was by design, as it ensured that the men entrusted with the monarch's safety were the ones who were directly tied to his own coin. Over the years, all kinds of mercenaries would be employed by the Byzantine emperors. However, the most famous of these were the Varangian guards, which shall be the main subject of our video today. But just how did these men of the north come to find themselves in such a position? The answer is that they followed the same path as most other mercenaries of the Hetairai, through treaties. But such deals don't just come out of nowhere. It turns out that the rulers of Constantinople had a long history of interactions with the men of the north. In fact, this dated back to the early days of antiquity, when goods like amber, fur, and livestock poured into the Mediterranean from Scandinavia by way of the Eastern European rivers that flowed into the Black Sea. The Byzantines made sure to keep a watchful eye on this frontier, involving themselves in the politics of the interior to ensure that trade continued to flow and to ward off potential attacks. In this last regard, though, they were not always successful. We have records of many raids issuing from the Black Sea and making ever more daring assaults across the wealthy lands of the south. This, in part, seems to have been a result of the rise of the Rus. They were a Norse people who had settled along the north-south merchant routes, assimilating with the Slavs of modern Ukraine and Eastern Europe. As ancestral traders and Vikings, they quickly came to dominate the region's economic activity and proved quite disruptive to the steppe politics of the area. Thus, the Byzantines were forced to factor them into the foreign policy calculus on this frontier. Over the 9th to 10th centuries, a series of treaties would be signed between the Rus and the Byzantines as both sides sized each other up. For instance, fighting between the two seems to have resulted in an 874 treaty, which obliged the Rus to provide men for Byzantine service. A few years later, a 907 treaty appears to have negotiated merchant rights, while the more substantive treaty of 911 expands talks to include matters of maritime trade, colonial rights, and mercenary service. This would be the seed for the Varangian Guard. At first, men came down from the north in dribs and drabs, finding employ in the Hetairai as individuals or small groups. Supposedly, around 700 of them served as Marines in a naval expedition against Crete, while around 400 joined the Byzantines for an Italian expedition. However, it would be in the year 988 when they finally came in full force. This occurred when Emperor Basil II requested military assistance from Vladimir I of Kiev, in accordance with a prior agreement established following the Byzantine victory at the siege of Dorostolon. Now, Vladimir would send 6,000 warriors, supposedly his most unruly men, to bolster the forces of the emperor. In exchange, the Kievan prince was given Basil's sister in marriage, while agreeing to convert and bring his people to the Christian faith. The Varangians would be exactly what Basil needed. Not just an elite corps of veteran warriors with which to smite his enemies in the field, but also a trustworthy force who would watch his back 24/7 in the dangerous world of shifting loyalties that was the Byzantine Empire. The Varangian Guard had just been born. Let us now try.
Yeah, it's been a while since we did watch the Basil series by History March. It's been a while, so I definitely forgot some things. But yeah, it's cool to see just kind of like the Rus and the Byzantines kind of like contact, and just how much contact the Romans actually had with so many places in the world, even, heard accounts of them in China. So it's just really cool for how long the Romans have been around and just basically talking to everybody. And yeah, like I said, something I always found interesting is how the Byzantines, I mean, you could say definitely later Rome, especially before the West fell, definitely became more heavily reliant on mercenaries. Because back then, the Romans used to kind of grow their own armies. Like, that was kind of their thing. They had infinite manpower. But as they kind of lost that before the fall of the West and never gained it back, I find it interesting just how they relied a lot on diplomacy and, money to essentially just buy mercenaries for their armies, and that the Varangian Guard, kind of that smart system of directly paying the mercenaries closest to essentially be your bodyguard, really kind of did work. So I don't know. I find that evolution of the Romans kind of fascinating,
How one would become a Varangian guardsman. For starters, all came from the far-off lands to the north. While in reality, they belonged to a variety of different communities, the Byzantines often lumped them all together as Varangians, a name whose etymology can be traced back to the Old Norse root of something like sworn companion. These lands far beyond the Mediterranean were poorly understood, often being described as a sort of semi-mythical land of barbarians. But the mystery worked both ways. The medieval Scandinavians, too, were only dimly aware of what lay to the distant south. What they did hear were rumors and stories which circulated back up the merchant routes. These spoke of a far-off land, known to them as Miklagard, where one could find a city of immeasurable wealth. Songs and sagas told of how its very rivers ran with gold. Such fanciful tales were common at the time, and surely there were skeptics. At first, only the most adventurous or desperate may have gone. Their gamble, though, was richly rewarded with fortune beyond anything they had seen in their lives. The greatest among them returned from the land of the Romans with enough wealth and prestige to forge kingdoms and inspire the Skalds for hundreds of years. For instance, while serving as a Varangian guard, Harald Hardrada would become one of the wealthiest Scandinavians of his age.
Certainly, we're no stranger to Hardrada and his famed career, and basically, he had quite the life, not only fighting in the Varangian Guard, but just fighting in a lot of major areas around the world. Like, this dude had a really great life. I'm surprised there's more people don't talk about him, I feel like he's definitely one of those characters whose story is so rich in history, but somehow we only really talk about him mainly at the end, with the battle, with his invasion of England and being destroyed by Godwinson. But there's just so much to him that the more I learn about him, I'm like, dang, this dude had a pretty awesome adventurous life. I'm surprised there's not more media about him, but oh well.
Eventually using his vast treasures to take over the throne of Norway, unifying the nation and inspiring legends that would be told for centuries. I'll now quote a few lines from his saga. Bleak gales lashed prows hard along the shoreline. Iron-shielded, our ships rode proud to harbour. Of Miklagard, our famous prince first saw the golden gables. Many a sea ship, fine arrayed, swept toward the high-walled city. This sort of tale proved infectious. Soon people from all walks of life were making their way south to strike it rich. This proved so destabilizing to the culture that laws had to be passed to deal with the implications of the gold rush. For instance, we have evidence of prohibitions being made to keep men who were actively serving in Greece from inheriting property back home. Traditionally, a prospective Varangian would travel with the great trading fleets that sailed south from the city of Novgorod. They would sail down the river Lovat and portage their longships overland to the Dnieper before making the journey down to Kiev. From there, they braved the 7 cataracts and sailed south across the Black Sea. Finally, they would arrive at the city of Constantinople and behold the majesty of a capital they had dreamed of for months. These men typically came in groups with their own commanders and would remain with their units once.
That's really cool. It kind of comes across like it seems to me like Miklagard is supposed to be Constantinople. I could be wrong about that, but like you get me, kind of like this awesome wealthy city. And yeah, again, like you gotta think, like back then, like we have the benefit now of just kind of Googling things and like kind of already knowing things too. But like back then, you could just hear this stuff and it must have been like mythical, right? Kind of like finding some kind of fantasy kingdom. Like, I could imagine the shock and awe of, like, braving such a great journey, and then seeing this for your own eyes and be like, the tales were true. Like, you know? Like, I don't know, that's gonna be awesome.
They were taken into service. Harold Hardrada, for instance, brought his own contingent of 500 Varangians, which remained a discreet mercenary company until they were formally integrated into the Byzantine army. The exact way in which a particular group of Northmen was employed would vary. Generally, though, this would take three forms: as the sailing Varangians, the mercenary Varangians, or the Varangians of the city. The sailing Varangians essentially functioned as Coast Guard privateers. They manned their own light, fast vessels which patrolled the sea lanes, protecting them from pirates. In exchange for this service, they were allowed to keep whatever plunder was gathered from a defeated ship, with only a token tithe being owed to the emperor. The Varangian mercenaries acted as a part of the wider mercenary groups of the Hetiri we previously mentioned. As such, they were used as garrison groups or standing forces and were always sent wherever fighting was fiercest or territory was most contested. These Varangians were renowned for their absolute loyalty and, unlike standard troops, could be relied on to never betray their city or army. They had the most possibilities for plunder and profit of any unit in the Byzantine military, being given the right to be the first ones to loot any conquered city. The final form of employment, and the most prestigious, was the group referred to as the Varangians of the city, whom we now know today as the Varangian Guard. Alongside all of the privileges given to the other, lower-tier Varangians, these men were showered in even more gold. The average Varangian of the city was paid anywhere from 30 to 40 gold numismata a month, about 30 to 40 times the average pay of an unskilled worker.
Wow.
The Guard as a whole also received 1/3 of the total loot taken in battle, with the other 2/3 going to the emperor and the rest of the army.
Dang.
Whenever a new emperor took the throne, in addition to the bonus that every new emperor paid to all standing military units, it was traditional for the Varangians to raid the previous emperor's private quarters and take as much as they could carry.
Holy crap, bro. Dang, dude. That's interesting.
All in all, it was a Viking's dream job. Because of all this, positions in the Varangian Guard were highly sought after and very competitive. Only those of sufficient reputation, connections, and wealth could rise to the top. The few who made it into their ranks were intensely protective of their position, making them unshakably loyal to their unit and the emperor. Let us now take a closer look at the fearsome disposition of these warriors. The ancient historian Michael Psellos describes them in the following manner. Quote, "Next to them stood men from the foreign mercenaries, Tauro-Scythians, terrible of aspect and huge of body. The soldiers were blue-eyed and kept their natural complexion. The Varangians fight like madmen, as if ablaze with wrath. Their arms, shoulders, and faces were also reported to be tattooed, a custom taken from the Turks. As for their equipment, when an adventurer headed south to the land of the Greeks, he would generally bring with him the gear of his native land. For defense, this meant donning pants, a shirt, mail armor, a nasal helmet, and a Norse-style shield. For offense, they might have a spear, axe, or sword. One traditional weapon which had a fearsome reputation were the massive two-handed battle axes.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I feel like whenever I look at the Varangian Guard, they're always depicted with the giant axe. You know, something about an axe, kind of like more than any other weapon, frightens me. Like, you know, see a guy with a sword or like a spear or something, like, not to say it isn't like, could be not frightening on the battlefield, but just something about like the axe, I feel like lends itself to like a kind of like bloodlust or like murder frenzy that inspires more fear in me than any other weapon. Especially like a huge dude. Like, think of like Patrick Bateman from American Psycho with the axe, you know? There's something about it like, I would not want to mess with like a dude with wielding an axe. Like, sword, spear, whatever, fine. But like, something about the axe, like, probably less, at least in my eyes, less, how do you say, elegant and just more, like, you know, it doesn't inspire a type of elegance, but more of like a kind of brutality that could really mess you up. And again, these guys were apparently like very tall and like huge, so just like this towering like giant with this big axe just swinging at you, like, oh heck no, I wouldn't want to fight that, you know? Dang, that's really cool.
Yet, as they adjusted to work under Byzantine employ and subsequently moved up the ranks, they would usually adopt new gear. This was made possible by their newfound wealth, in addition to their access to superior armories, which could be found in and around Constantinople. When it came to defense, it seems that simple chain shirts were now traded in for longer pieces, which covered more of the body and even rose to cover their faces. Over this was worn additional lamellar armor and ornate helmets, as well as arm and shin guards. Such was the increased weight of all this material that warriors often wore what is known as the leather Varangian bra for support. But that wasn't all. They also wielded larger, more elaborately decorated shields, with many guards adopting the great kite design of the Byzantines, which put to shame their old Nordic hand-me-downs.
It's true, kite shields are really effective. There's this video I saw on YouTube about how like a Byzantine soldier would have been armored, and a big part of their military evolution, like when we watch like the Byzantine videos from Overly Sarcastic Productions, that they implemented the kite shield, which at times could be, I think, more better than the standard shields that they were using, mainly because they're able to put it down or something like that. And I think, like, I forgot the guy who made that video about how, like, Byzantine soldiers would be, armed. He did bring up the kite shield and its effectiveness in battle. I forgot how he did it, but, like, something like you could probably, like, stab it to the ground for more, staying power or something. You know, I play this game called Mount & Blade Warband, and I've been using the kite shield a lot more in that game. Like, before I used to use, like, the round Housecarl shield, but I find that the kite shield also, because of its longer depth, not only is it like lighter, but it's also it has a better coverage range, so that might be another thing. So yeah, definitely there's just something really cool about it. I'm starting to become quite the fan of the kite shield myself.
In terms of offense, the Varangians seem to have remained relatively faithful to their heritage, though often weapons were upgraded with precious metal. For instance, while a warrior might hold on to his great axe, he would probably also have acquired a more lavish Greek sword as a sidearm or backup. One item, which seems to have been quite popular though, was the Horom fire, a distinctly Byzantine weapon descended from the ancient falx.
Wow.
It was alternately described as a polearm, tipped with a long, concave, curved blade, or a sword about a meter long with a single-edge curved blade.
Yeah, the polearm one looks interesting. I was staring at it. I was thinking, I was wondering, what is that? But I'm glad he's bringing it up because it looks kind of like, I feel like I've seen stuff like that, like in more Asian countries, like Japan or, like China. It looks very like it should belong more eastward, at least from first glance. But yeah, very interesting. I didn't know that the Byzantines used this.
Such was its prominence among the Varangians of the city that it became known as the symbol of the emperor's bodyguard. All in all, it can be said that just looking at these hulking, bejeweled warriors would put fear into the heart of any man who faced them.
Like I said, if I saw that, I'd be like, I don't want to fight that. I'm good, Because look at that. That's terrifying. It is awe-inspiring for sure.
This would only have been enhanced by stories of their mysterious
Gaza's population.
Gothic dance, which reportedly featured Varangians performing a ritual in animal skins and masks while chanting and clashing weapons against shields. Now, let us turn to a discussion of how they were put to use by the emperors. As we mentioned previously, the Varangians were a part of the Hetiri Corps of the Byzantine army. Its organization is poorly understood. Some sources from the Middle Period mention the Hetiri as being composed of 3 or 4 units, which were further broken down into companies. Altogether, some historians have estimated their strength at around 1 to 2,000. However, this would all have changed with the arrival of the Varangians in the 10th century and the reforms of the Komnenos dynasty of the 11th century. When these get mentioned by our sources, it's all done in a rather eclectic manner. Mentions vary from a few hundred guardsmen holding the capital to a few thousand marching on campaign with not much context. As such, it is quite hard to reconstruct the organization of the Varangian Guard. Likely, it was made up of several sub-units with various ranks of officers. What these were remains a mystery and probably changed over time. We do, however, know a bit about their top commander, known as the Archoluthos, or the man just behind the emperor. He was a figure of extremely high importance. In fact, it was said that when the emperor was away, he was the one entrusted with the keys to Constantinople. Initially, the Archoluthos seems to have commanded the entire Hetiri. Later, he would exclusively lead the Varangians of the city. Eventually, however, the position would fall from grace following the sack of Constantinople in the Fourth Crusade, being demoted to the 50th man in line behind the emperor. Let us now turn to the duties of the rank-and-file members. The Varangians were quartered across the city of Constantinople. Their primary residences included the following: the old barracks of the excubitores, the special Varangian district around the port of Marmas, and the area around Galata Tower across the Golden Horn. They even had their own church dedicated to Saint Olaf Haraldsson, the half-brother of Harald Hardrada, and the Virgin Mary, named Our Lady of the Varangians, not far from the Hagia Sophia. As for their daily activities, technically speaking, they did a bit of everything, functioning as a useful source of manpower for the emperor to use as he saw fit. That being said, we can generalize their activities based on the scope of each type of Varangian unit. For instance, the members of the sailing Varangians were often seen putting their nautical heritage to good use, hunting pirates through the Aegean and along the Anatolian coast. The Varangian mercenaries, meanwhile, could be seen posted up in the various important garrisons of the empire or serving as core shock troops for the army in the field. At times, they might even be given command of regular units for special missions, as was the case of one Ragnvald, who was active in Greece. And finally, the Varangians of the city acted as a hybrid bodyguard or police force within Constantinople itself. Wherever the emperor went, these hulking warriors would be there to act as the lictors of ancient Rome, clearing a path through crowds with whips and attending all important ceremonies of state alongside their master. Guardsmen also saw to the security of imperial property and the city's great churches. This could be a quite monotonous job for such warriors, and it's no surprise that one of them, a man by the name of Halfdan, ended up etching out a bit of graffiti on the second floor of the Hagia Sophia, which can still be seen to this day.
Oh, really?
Perhaps a more exciting assignment, though, would be their patrols of the city. Here, the Varangian guards had a chance to flex their might, busting up rioters, enforcing laws, and arresting high-profile targets who might otherwise be able to turn aside less loyal troops. They also served as jailers and torturers in the infamous Numera prison. Apparently, they made quite the impression with the Byzantine poets, depicting screaming Varangians as demons in their descriptions of hell. For example, Michael...
Dang. It's cool to see them. Like I said, I'm very interested, and I've had like a great idea of hearing a lot about them. But it's so cool to finally be seeing in depth about the many hats that they wore, you know? And yeah, I was saying like these definitely are very much well, they all want to, like, a big part of them showing up was definitely to gain wealth and prestige. But I'm also thinking like, they strike me as like warriors, so I'm like wondering how they just kind of like dealt with just kind of being more stationary, you know, and not being all out on the battlefield if they got like bored or discontented. But with all these various jobs, I guess they're always doing something to a degree, so it's never, you know, I don't know. But it's really cool to see just how many hats they wore, because I kind of knew them as mainly just a bodyguard and, you know, warrior unit. But yeah, it's good to see how versatile they could be in various positions and roles, and just how useful they could be.
Glycus wrote these lines of a poem based on his experiences. Quote, "Hades I call the Numera, but even worse than Hades are the shouting Varangoi and terrors which keep you awake."
Oh my goodness.
When they weren't on the battlefield or terrorizing the locals, the Varangians were known as the Emperor's wineskins. They were reputed to have a great love for Greek women and an even greater love for Greek wine. Their drunkenness is well documented, with 2 separate instances of drunk Varangians even attacking emperors, Nicephorus III and Michael IV.
Wow.
They were regular spectators at the infamous Byzantine chariot races and frequently participated in the brawls that accompanied such events. Thus we see that within but a few decades of their arrival, the Varangians had become just another part of the vivid social tapestry that was life in Byzantine Constantinople. Now, let us consider how they were also woven into the military history of the empire. We will start with a generalized description of their use. On the battlefield, they functioned primarily as heavy infantry arrayed in a dense formation. A commander might choose to deploy them aggressively as shock troops, meant to break through enemy lines or fortified positions. Alternatively, they might be held back in defense, ready to plug any holes in the front line, or to defend the emperor in the event of a retreat. In either case, they excelled as elite troops. Yet the Varangians were not limited to such basic tactics. More skilled commanders combined them with other forces like horse archers to brutal effect. Working together, the paired units could mutually support one another and take on all kinds of foes who might otherwise be able to defeat them individually.
That is so cool. We've seen the Varangians a few times. I think the most recent is when we watched the Norman Kingdom of Italy series by Kings and Generals. Alexios used them in the front lines, the though the Varangians gained the upper hand, pushing back the enemy, they strayed too far and got hit from the rear, and then destroyed like that because they strayed too far from the rest of the battlefield. But yeah, it's cool to see that. Like the Horse Archer Varangian like tag team seems incredibly awesome.
Even more tactics were possible. To get a sense of this, let's explore their track record over the years.
Alright, hit me.
Unfortunately, in this regard, it is actually quite difficult to piece together a detailed service history. We know that they played a core role in the army, but our sources seem to take this fact for granted, rarely giving us explicit confirmation of their deployment or their actions in battle. As such, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the sorts of campaigns they likely may have been part of during their lifespan, with a few specifics thrown in when they are available. We can pick up the narrative with the original 6,000 Varangians sent to assist Basil II in 989 AD. Their arrival proved fortuitous, significantly bolstering his forces, which now set out to take on the pretender Phocas in Asia. The rival's head was cut off, and his army turned to flight, with the Varangians reportedly hacking the enemy to pieces with glee. With the rebellion soon stamped out, the emperor would next turn his attention to external foes, embarking on a whirlwind series of campaigns led in person, which likely meant that the Varangians were right there at his side. In 995 and 999, the Byzantines counterpunched against the Fatimid incursions in Syria, fighting a series of raids, battles and sieges to restore the safety of the eastern borders. Now, Basil would turn west. He directed his attention against the Bulgar Empire, which had previously bested the Byzantines, dangerously expanding their influence in the region. However, armed with the Varangians, things would be different. For nearly 10 years, repeated bloody campaigns would be launched against the Bulgars, slowly grinding down their fortresses and their armies. The struggle climaxed in 1014 at the Battle of Clydon. Here, Byzantine forces hammered the front of a heavily fortified valley pass, finally breaking through when troops were maneuvered over rough terrain to threaten the enemy's rear. In the aftermath,
The flank, the oldest trick in the book. This is coming back to me, I think, this battle.
it was said that Bulgarian prisoners were divided into groups of 100, 99 of them being blinded, with the remaining one guiding them back home. This ultimately precipitated the end of the war. The Byzantines now claimed dominion over these lands, with Basil earning the name the Bulgar Slayer. It had been a brutal affair, in which the ferocity of the Varangians must have been greatly appreciated. But the fighting did not end there. Basil and his guard next campaigned in Crimea, Georgia, and Armenia. Varangians were even sent as far as Italy to fight the Lombards, where they proved victorious at the Battle of Cannae in 1018. Such was the scale of Basil's military campaigning that by his death in 1025, the Byzantine Empire would reach its greatest territorial heights in the Middle Ages. According to the ancient historian Psellos, he crushed rebellions, subdued the feudal landowners, conquered the enemies of the empire. The treasury was overflowing with the accumulated plunder of Basil's campaigns. Everywhere the might of Roman arms was respected and feared.
Yeah, Basil was amazing, dude. One of the best of the Byzantine era of Roman emperors. I'm again, the guy was amazing. Too bad it all got screwed up immediately after he died. I remember the First Crusade series by Kings and Generals. Immediately after his death, everything fell apart, and then the Romans shortly after lost Anatolia, and then as the Turks got in, and just Yeah, it's kind of sad. Knowing all this greatness and then seeing how it all fell apart after. But either way, yeah, that's really cool.
Though they get no official credit, it's safe to say that the Varangians had a large hand to play in this triumph.
Yeah, I'd imagine they would be there. I mean, it'd be weird if Basil didn't bring them, right? And just didn't use them after gaining, like, what, 6,000 of them? I feel like, yeah, it's safe to say they were there and pretty instrumental.
The successors of Basil, however, struggled to match his achievements. More wars were launched across the various frontiers, which kept the Varangians busy, but, by and large, the Byzantine military machine was slowing down. The empire was struggling both economically and politically, which led to military cuts that only further accelerated its decline in the face of new, emerging threats. Amid all this, the Varangians stood firmly at their posts. They held true to their oaths of loyalty, but at times did have to pick a side when things got messy. For instance, when the deeply unpopular Emperor Michael V attempted to assassinate the Patriarch and purge members of the Macedonian dynasty, he would be removed from the throne by a revolt in 1042. Legend tells that the Varangian guardsman Harold Hardrada dragged Michael from his sanctuary, blinding and castrating the ex-emperor before banishing him into exile.
Ooh.
Thereafter,
I heard of the blinding, but not the part where they castrated him. Holy crap. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there were times I think we covered the Varangians, either kind of threw in the towel or I kind of did that. But considering how confusing and all over the place Roman politics were, I feel like it was unavoidable that they would have to eventually kind of like get, Either way, they're still way better than the Praetorians. The Praetorians suck. The Varangians, though, by comparison, are everything. Coolest bodyguards in history, in my opinion.
a series of rather ineffectual rulers led the Byzantine Empire, further overseeing its decline. This poor state of affairs was made evident at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. Here, the Byzantines were drawn in and surrounded by the Turks, who ultimately broke them when the Western forces attempted a controlled retreat. In this fight, the professional core of the army, and the Varangians in particular, stood steadfast by the emperor. However, their enveloped position was untenable. One by one, they were picked off. All would be massacred. In the aftermath, civil war wreaked further havoc among the Byzantines, who were sent into a precipitous decline. Yet complete disaster would be averted by the valiant efforts of the Komnenian dynasty. The army and the Varangians would slowly be rebuilt. Apparently, it's around this time that the Guard increasingly became dominated by Anglo-Saxons who had been displaced by the Norman conquests of England. One source even claims that some 5,000 of them arrived at one time. Clearly, so long as there was money to be had in Miklagard, the Varangians would endure. They would now be put to use in the various campaigns of Emperor Alexius Komnenos. For instance, in 1081, they would find themselves near the city of Dyrrhachium, facing off against a Norman invasion force under Robert Wiscard. Here, they would be placed in the vanguard alongside a force of mercenary horse archers called the Vardariate. The imperial battle plan was simple and effective. The Varangians would open ranks and allow the horse archers to skirmish back and forth. When the Normans had been sufficiently bloodied, then the Varangians, along with the rest of the army, would charge and break the spine of the enemy host. Initially, the plan seems to have worked. The Norman line wavered in its initial skirmishes, their left even breaking when met with more sustained contact. Seeing this, the Varangians charged, thirsting for blood and battle. The Normans crumbled before the onslaught, Men and horses panicked before these giant men with their massive axes who slaughtered everything in sight. Unfortunately, they had cut too deeply, isolating themselves from the rest of the army. The Normans capitalized on this, quickly swarming in with the spearmen to hold them in position and crossbowmen to whittle them down. The Varangians realized they had to play for time and made a stand within the church of Michael the Archangel atop a nearby hill. Unfortunately for them, no help would be coming. The Byzantine flanks had both over-pursued, leaving the center completely exposed to a devastating countercharge by the Norman knights and their elite forces. The Byzantine army was shattered, the emperor even being wounded but managing to escape. Now, the Normans could turn their full might upon the stranded Varangians. The Guard made a heroic last stand, with the survivors pulling back within the church itself. However, no mercy would be shown. Fire was rained upon the house of God, burying the Varangians in burning timbers.
Oh, what an awful way to go.
But that was not the end of the Northmen. Like phoenixes, they arose from the ashes once more. Over the following centuries, they would serve the emperors faithfully through thick and thin. Among the new threats they were forced to deal with were the various crusades launched by Western European powers against the East. Initially, these seemed to be a welcome source of relief, helping to push back the Seljuks and bringing in new sources of manpower that replenished the Guard and other units. This gave the Byzantines enough breathing room to push back other threats, such as the invading Pechenegs. At the Battle of Beroia in 1122,
Ralph's Shoppers?
The Varangians proved key in the final action that punched through the enemy wagon fort, collapsing the enemy center entirely and leading to victory. However, fresh waves of crusaders complicated the geopolitics of the region. At first, they formed a tenuous alliance with Constantinople, sometimes teaming up for joint campaigns that may have seen the Varangians deployed as far away as Egypt. Eventually, though, weak Byzantine rulers could no longer master the situation. Cooperation turned to competition among allies, and enemies were emboldened. The Fourth Crusade would actually end up seeing Christian forces besiege and sack Constantinople in 1204. It was reported that the Varangians fought bravely atop the walls with axe and sword before finally being overwhelmed. The last mention of the Varangian Guard appears in the Chronicle of the Morea, which states that they served to provide escort duty in 1259 for the Empire of Nicaea, one of the three major fragments of the Byzantine Empire which had been created following the sack of Constantinople. Following this, our sources go silent on their ultimate fate.
Wow, really? No definitive end. That kind of adds to the aura, though. Like, they just did not mention anymore. We don't know exactly when the end of the Guard came, or like when the unit just ceased to exist. But what an awesome unit, dude. Like I said, these guys are cool, not only like in terms of like aesthetic of how frightening they would be, but just like, again, granted, obviously with most people, definitely motivated by the wealth, but like, I feel like what made them very different, because I think the Praetorians were similar in that respect too. Obviously, they only cared about like wealth and themselves at the end, but like the Varangians also were just loyal because of it, and you know, like awesome units that could actually like be incredibly effective. Like I said, I'm really happy to have looked at this video, because while I was already acquainted with the Chadness of the Varangians, this definitely adds in a lot more depth that makes them even greater in my eyes. Probably the coolest bodyguard units in history, in my opinion.
perhaps they lingered a few more decades, slowly fading away into memory alongside the Byzantine Empire they had served faithfully for nearly 400 years. We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most famous units of history.
I really did. That was awesome. Overall, another great video from Invicta. I'm really happy to have seen this. And again, these guys are just so cool. Yeah, overall, I'm just really happy with this. Very much Chad. Very Chad in many ways.